far too long, billions of dollars of foreign aid has been poured into developing nations, and yet the poorest people in these communities have languished in poverty and desperation. We think the time has come to empower these low-income people in these nations. What do we support in this debate? We support, first of all, direct transfers to these in the regional currency that we prioritise to individuals in these developing nations. People within these nations can apply for this funding, and we're actually going to have extensive information spread in these communities to inform them of the opportunity to receive funding. We think that NGOs will be able to still freely operate in these nations under this model, but what we don't support is the status quo where large sums of money are being transferred directly to corrupt governments and the poorest citizens are left behind. We're going to discuss this over 4 substantive points. First of all, I'm going to talk about why. The reason that we're having this debate and how the current aid system is failing. Secondly, I'm going to talk about how we actually help the people that are most in need. Lastly, I'm going to discuss how we instigate social and democratic change. Nick is going to talk at Split about how he empowers women in these countries where they are a minority. So what is the principal framework under which this debate takes place? So we think that inherently the duty of aid is to best improve the living conditions of those that are impoverished within these nations. So if we prove, one, that we get a better society in these nations, but second of all, improve the living standards of these people, we win today's debate. So, on to my first point. Now, the reason that we're actually having this debate is because the current aid system is failing in so many ways. So, the inefficiencies of this system essentially stem from the government being ineffective and not spending this money well. I'll take POI.
Sure. So under your model, when you're talking about spending in regional currencies, do you think that regional currencies are a reliable way to pay people?
Look, we think that the regional currency is just the best way to do it within these nations, because there are many nations where US dollars might not necessarily be a valued currency in that system. We think that inherently people aren't going to want to be trading US dollars for goods and services when they actually don't have an educational basis at which to value this money upon. So that's pretty easy to deal with. So they don't know how to spend this money already in these nations. The government's inherently misinformed the way they're spending them, right? We think that even in cases where the government does have a good intention when spending this money, by putting a Chinese-built highway into a community where the actual people living there that are expected to utilise it don't have the vehicles to utilise the highway is ineffective, and we think that when the people can't use it. We think that when we actually target funding towards individual people instead of towards these governments and groups, we get better outcomes for them. The second way in which this works is that the governments under the status quo tend to target groups, right? They tend to invest in important electorates for their own political gain. This is why in developing nations you see disproportionate investment in cities when compared to rural communities, because the cities are the electorates and the selectorates that have the most political capital, so the governments have an incentive to invest there. That's why the rural communities tend to languish in these nations and tend to never get uplifted out of poverty and merely exist as subsistence farmers. We can't stand for this. We improve that under our side of the house. But the second way in which this works is just the blatant corruption of these governments, right? This manifests in 2 key ways. First of all, on the low level, right? Regional officials within these areas, even if they are in the regions, even if they are in rural electorates, they're still going to take a large sum of the money for themselves, right? So the only effect that you get for the individual person is this trickle-down effect from getting the wealth that they receiving some of the wealth that they are then spending within that community. But it also really harmfully manifests itself on the high level. When states use aid to develop their military instead of actually investing in pulling people out of poverty. And they feed their electorates rather than actually investing in those people that need it most. That brings me to my second point, which is how we actually uplift people out of poverty on this side of the house. Capital allows them to uplift themselves out of some of the most desperate situations, just on the most basic level. But the second way in which this works is that these communities can actually prioritise their investment now. Through the government, the only effects you're actually getting for the lowest of the low is this kind of trickle-down effect. And it doesn't allow, just one second, it doesn't allow the most impoverished communities to actually address the very important issues. So, as I was saying, like these communities can prioritise their investment now that they actually have a basis upon which they can base their decisions. So people can like actually now focus on some of the more pressing issues in their community, right? Maybe they can focus on actually getting a new teacher in a system where maybe the classes are really big, right? If the classes are way too big, they can now actually address these issues. They're not trying to just simply put food on the table. They're thinking more in the long term, right? And we think this manifests itself clearly in like rural communities when people can focus on actually improving the efficiency at which they operate. Maybe they can now pull together and think about like investing in better agricultural technology such as a tractor, right? This may seem very basic, but under status quo, these people simply don't have the means to actually even start to think about making these changes. Last point is how we actually encourage democratic and social change. So we recognise that the current aid system is quite pervasive, there's quite perverse incentives for the government to spend it ineffectively, and we think that when it comes to the aid being given state to state, much of it is, the very basis of it is done for political gain from the state actually giving money, right? So we think that to promote, there's an incentive to promote Western values such as liberal democracy and freedom, but how do we actually achieve these values better on our side of the house? Two key ways. First of all, it's a fact that when people get their financial independence, they can start thinking about the long term, right? Now they might actually have a long-term care about government, right? Because when you hold an election, right, and there are people that are trying to put food on the table the same day as the election, do you think they're going to, think about going to the polls that day or actually try and feed their family? We think that under the current system, they're not even actually thinking about engaging with the political system, but when you give them just a really tiny bit of capital, they're able to now think about actually engaging with the political system and inciting some kind of change. Lastly, we think that people hold their government to account now they have capital, actually start thinking about the issues that the government has been addressing badly, and this is the key way in which they are able to uphold themselves and improve their communities. We are proud to propose.
Thanks for the speech, what's next?
Come on.
Yeah, I screwed it up, my bad.
The third world is currently in a dire state, and blindly throwing money at the issue instead of making tangible difference is a short-sighted plan by the affirming team. We on the negating side realise that the true goal of fixing the issues in extreme impoverished nations are to create independent and sustainable economic growth, something that can only be achieved through infrastructure improvement and the giving of resources. Allow me to compare the two worlds that are currently being debated over right now. The kind of difference that will be made by the affirming team will be that a guy is able to plant some crops and, feed his family. And while that is good, we would much rather that guy be able to go and learn to become a mechanic, so we can improve the infrastructure in the country, so that farming tech can be produced there and then used in the country to better improve their resource collection, than simply giving him the money to go and plant some stuff. It's the difference between giving 500,000 people $1 each and building a sustainable school that can be, free education. Money is far more efficiently allocated when you're allocating it towards infrastructure, tangible change. I'd like to give an example of something that is going on in India. Instead of giving money, the companies within India have made smartphones very cheap. In India, most people can get a smartphone for about $20 or something, and for $5 a month, they get virtually unlimited data. This has revolutionized the way that people in India do business and done far more for their economy than blindly throwing money would. These are the types of changes that make genuine effects. With these phones, they're able to do all of their trading online in a way that most impoverished countries cannot. Yes, sir?
Making phones cheap isn't what developmental aid is. Do you not agree?
Oh, I was not suggesting that we make phones cheap in Africa. I'm saying this is an example of an infrastructural and a tangible improvement that isn't just throwing money at people, that makes a much bigger difference than plain cash giving. On further to how the current system and the current lack of infrastructure and money-thoughtful culture would make the money just being thrown at people by the affirming team's model ineffective. Not only less effective, but ineffective. At the moment, in a lot of these impoverished nations, because of the state of their economy, they generally don't have a culture to understand saving and these money concepts. Living in westernized nations, we have a strong concept of money. We understand how to deal with money, at least at somewhat of a level. But for a lot of these countries, there is not that culture, and they simply don't have that understanding. And blindly giving them money will not fix that problem. Yes, sir?
Don't you agree that many of these people actually have to run their businesses incredibly efficiently with savings, even just to get by under the status quo?
Absolutely not. In a lot of these countries, you see, while there is business going on, the business is going on in a sense that is just, and in a very informal sense. A lot of the time, they don't have tills at these businesses. They'll collect cash and put it in their, keep it in their pockets. Businesses can be run so much more efficiently and effectively if we improve the infrastructure, more than just simply giving them more cash. People don't have, as the affirming team said, these people in impoverished countries generally don't have the concept of investing money or in these types of things. So why would throwing money at them in any way fix that problem? Onwards to other practical issues around throwing money into a hole. At the moment, lots of these impoverished nations are impoverished also because not only do they lack money, which is a very intangible kind of, they lack resources. And in a country that is going through a drought, everyone having an extra $10, $50 is not going to be able to get them more water. Because the people who have the water are going to charge whatever they are able to charge to give that water away. The current aid system that gives water and food and these types of resources to the impoverished nations is far more effective at helping when they are resource poor in a country. Throwing blind money that can then not be used is simply going to inflate the regional currency beyond levels of understanding, where the money is just worthless and an absolute waste of money. No, thank you. Also, the affirming team brings up a strange paradigm where they propose that the governments in these countries are corrupt in their absolute essence, and therefore we are still giving money in that government's regional currency. We think that if the government is as corrupt as the affirming team is asserting it to be, giving that regional currency will just lead to more corruption. Won't the government raise their taxes? Won't the government take their money back? It's their own resource. It's ridiculous. And the affirming team seems to think that blindly throwing money at people will change their culture. The affirming team asserted that once they have money, they'll start spending it better. They'll suddenly realise the Western value of money and the investment and how banks work. When, as we said, only through infrastructure, education, creation of these.
Sir.
Yes, sir.
Someone doesn't need a vast knowledge of saving to know that $20 more in their pocket can actually feed their family in a way that infrastructure investment never can. Why is that not the case?
Well, as I said earlier, while it would be great giving a man enough money to harvest some crops and feed his family for the night, we would much rather that man be able to gain the skills to then improve the infrastructure and the farming in the entire country so that they can all have crops for years to come. This is a band-aid that is going to need to be refixed every few years. You give them an extra money, they can survive. Then you give them more, they can survive. And we're constantly, as my second speaker will go into, the point of creating dependency, so which binds us and it binds them and it makes them feel like second-class citizens, and it's unsustainable. We on the affirming team are showing that the only way to achieve sustainable economic growth in the third world is through infrastructure improvements. We've shown that infrastructure is far more important than blindly throwing money, and we've shown how giving that money will be ineffective in and of itself. Thank you.
Thanks, speaker for speech. Second back.
Highway empty, with no cars flowing to the ports taking goods overseas. A school empty, a classroom with no students. That is the world which they are setting up under their side of the house. Because that is the status quo that we're confronting. Infrastructural investment which poor people in these developing countries simply do not have access to. We fix that under our side of the house. We tell you, when these people are able to educate, to gain skills, to exert political pressure, that is then not only are they able to uplift themselves out of their most dire situations, that is when you get the very investment that they don't get under the status quo when development aid is given to these governments. I'm going to be talking to you about a single point about how we uplift women in these developing countries, but firstly, I'm going to be talking through two broad issues in this debate. Firstly, how do we uplift economically, like in the immediate term, those in need in these countries? And secondly, how do we get long-term democratic and social change? Okay, firstly then, we'd like to point out that none of the analysis that Kale gave you about what is wrong with the status quo was ever engaged with from their side of the house. Because essentially what we heard was a generic line about how infrastructure investment is so great, which belied the very fact that that is what these current developmental aid is given to these governments to do, and it is not working. Why was that the case? We told you that there was unequal spending in how that money goes, simply through just bureaucratic inefficiencies, but also through more insidious incentives, like the political incentive, the fact that many rural people don't have access to democratic processes, which means there is very little incentive for these governments to invest in these communities because they don't get anything in return, in terms of political capital in that sense. Never a response to that. Secondly, we told you, crucially, that there was corruption within these countries. And they said oh, but that will still exist under your side of the house. Quite clearly it won't. When at the point where you actually directly give the money to someone, it skips over those corrupt processes, both in terms of low-level regional officials taking bribes, taking cuts out of that infrastructure investment, but at a much wider governmental level, you surpass that as well. So what did we hear from their side of the house? Essentially, a lot of their response to the fact that we were going to uplift communities within these communities was that they said these people don't have a culture of saving, and that they wouldn't know what to do with the money. So there are a few responses to that. Firstly, that's premised on the fact that the government is comparatively better and knows how to uplift these communities. What we're talking about here is a political bureaucrat in the capital, which might be significantly more developed than these rural areas, sitting down in a room with a bunch of other people and literally dictating what it is that these people in these rural communities need. We tell you the comparative is very, very clear. But actually people within these communities know what it is that they need. They know that when they are given money, not only can they invest in their family, actually provide for their own basic needs, but they can maybe save up and buy a tractor, which actually helps them farm more efficiently and sell their extra produce. It actually allows them to send their kid to school, to put the political pressure on to do that. So beyond that, we tell you that people are better able to upskill themselves within that. We told you that people can move out, for example. Maybe they could move to an urban area where there is better job prospects than in their rural area. So whether they stayed and uplifted their own community or they moved out somewhere with better job prospects, both of that is enabled under our side of the house. Essentially what needs to be met, the comparative here, is that we were the side that actually gave that initial kickstart for these people to uplift themselves in actually tangible ways. The fact that they just wanted to stand for perhaps we'll get this sort of long-term change, when at the point where people can't take advantage of that, it simply was no benefit at all. Okay. Finally then, no thank you, they were sort of but what happens in a drought? What happens when there's no infrastructural investment? Okay, firstly, I've already proven to you that actually often these communities don't see any of the types of infrastructural investment. But even beyond that, we think that these communities, even if they're not incredibly tight-knit and one big happy family, can quite easily see that there are common goals that needed to be met, right? So it's quite likely when they actually have the money, they can band together and actually maybe build a well, because we don't think that they're so stupid that they can't understand that actually having fresh water is something which everyone in the community benefits from. We think that when they're able to come together and uplift themselves in tandem, that is when you get those best sort of benefits to those communities. Finally, on infrastructure investment, and this is a new response to what we heard from Kale, we think that infrastructural investment is often uniquely damaging, and that countries often premise that on having making the foreign on these developing countries open up their markets to foreign regulation and foreign companies that come in and seize the resources, right? So at the point where they're saying that they're the side that somehow uplifts and gives people access to these resources, we tell you that at the point at which often there is a dichotomy in terms of when you give developmental aid, there is something expected in return in terms of opening up markets to foreign investment. Then these people again don't get to see the profits of their own resources, of their own capital. Yes.
So in your example, when you're building a highway, don't you agree that by employing local workers to do so, you are actually boosting the economy through that aid?
Okay, so firstly, clearly these areas aren't really getting highways. Secondly, it's often done by foreign people because these people likely wouldn't have the skills. That's why you see Chinese companies coming into all of Africa and building highways. It's not let's employ all these local farmers who have no idea how to engineer, how to drive these heavy machineries to operate that. So no, we don't think, even if that was the case, then they actually see those benefits. Okay, let's move on and talk about long-term change and how we actually benefit these people socially. And this will bleed into what I'm talking about in terms of uplifting women within these communities. Firstly, we told you, when people are able to meet their most basic needs, when they're able to put food on the table and actually able to do that, that is when they can focus on their more social and democratic freedoms that they previously didn't see as important to themselves. That means that they may be better able, because they are not constantly working, constantly worried about whether or not they can feed their family, to actually be able to put food on the table and actually able to go and lobby the government and try and actually see the change they want to see in that. Secondly and crucially, and this is in a distinct way, we told you that they're actually better able to hold the government to account, right? Because now they see the comparative. They see what they got through their own developmental aid when they were empowered, and they saw what the government did, which is leaving them behind and doing nothing. We tell you that that comparative allows them to more directly hold the government to account because they see what they're missing out on in that sense. Okay, now let's talk about directly how we benefit women within these developing countries. Because we tell you there are a few problems under the status quo. We tell you that often women are financially dependent within their families and they aren't able to go and pursue the same opportunities as other people, like men within that economy. But secondly, we tell you that there are structural inequalities in access to opportunity, right? That often they can't go to school, it's harder for them to get employed by male-dominated businesses, and so they aren't able to benefit in that sense. We help them in two key ways. Firstly, we actually give women autonomy and being able to leave abusive relationships and actually move out and be financially independent. They can apply for this funding and actually set up their own business, and rather than having to go through patriarchal structures which never benefit them, they are able to do what is best for them. Secondly, we send an incredibly positive signalling effect that shows that when women actually are given this money, there is both a positive feedback loop in that these women are given money, they go out and do well, and then that empowers more women to do that. We tell you at the end of this debate, they were the side that were living in a utopian world that didn't engage with the status quo. The status quo which has left people behind in which has never benefited them. We actually helped those who needed it most. We win today's debate.
Back Street to the Street, second Mac.
Okay, so the F's model today has a lot of holes in it. Basically, what this debate is really about is about whether or not infrastructure is, like complex infrastructure is important in the third world, and whether or not that complex infrastructure is actually achieved under the F's model. So we basically see that, like in the developed world, the thing that makes the developed world better off than the developing world is not because of lack of money, but because of the actual way that things are conducted. In the first world, I don't have to farm crops because I can buy food from the supermarket. I don't need to work directly for my survival because large-scale infrastructure exists in this world. The F's only real development that they've provided us with is that people have enough common sense to gather together and build their own infrastructure. But that's at a dichotomy with the fact that they also characterize third world inhabitants as being unskilled workers who don't know anything about engineering and wouldn't be able to build any complex infrastructure when they were talking about why foreign aid is built by overseas people. So basically what we would see in their world is while communities might be able to build a well, nobody is going to be able to build actually complicated infrastructure without planning, direction, and involvement from developed countries that actually have the skill sets to be able to do it. So basically what we have to prove to you to win this debate is, firstly, because this seems to be contentious, whether or not infrastructure is actually a valid form of foreign aid and whether it falls under the category of under motion, which it does, and I'll explain that in a second. Whether or not the infrastructure actually provides benefits, and also I'm going to have to deal with whether or not there's more engagement in democracies. No, thank you. From whether there's more engagement of democracies and whether or not women are better off. So, firstly, onto the point about whether or not infrastructure is a valid form of development aid. So, basically, it would be in the same model as we don't have to support on the neg the giving of the money to corrupt third world governments. We can support a model of what China does in Africa and what China does in Nepal, where they just send in the Chinese to go and build the things. We can stand for that as long as the infrastructure is getting there. We can also stand for an NGO model of NGOs using development aid to go in and build the infrastructure ourselves. So if the government is corrupt and is unable to build the infrastructure, we're fine for standing for circumnavigating the government and having the infrastructure built by foreign nations or NGOs. We think that that's still a fine interpretation of development aid. And the kind of things that we're building, and they can build schools, they can build better roads. They can teach financial skills. We talked about running the businesses out of the pocket, and things not having concepts of regular wages and not having banks attitudes of banks not being trusted. Yep.
When China builds ports, say in Sri Lanka, and then they get a 99-year lease on that to take out pretty much all of the profits from those local communities, how does that uplift those people?
Well, it's in the world where that port doesn't exist, even if they have enough money to, in the world where a road doesn't exist, in a world where they have enough money to buy a car, they still don't have a road to drive it on. So the benefits that any members of that world would get from being able to interact with the infrastructure is better because in the F's world, the infrastructure just doesn't exist and people can never elevate themselves out of the inefficient systems that exist right now in the third world. So yeah, the reason that it's a black hole is because the developing world is a black hole of money is because what you're basically doing is propping up unsustainable economic methods that would fall apart if they were subject to normal economic pressures. So things just being an agrarian society, just having goats, farming crops and stuff like that is not actually ever going to make the developing world developed. No, thank you. And what's likely going to happen if you give every member of the developing world cash is they're just going to spend it on enough goats to feed their family until next week, or that they're going to pay until they're fit. Sure.
How does someone who's working multiple jobs, farming day to night, ever find the time or the money to go and utilise the schools and all this like infrastructure that you've supposedly built?
Well, there's lots of ways that they can do that. So like, so say you are a farmer, like I'll go with that. You're like farming day and night. But if you live in a world where there's like, where there's enough financial stability for businesses to run that sell like complex farming equipment, like tractors and stuff like that, you can farm more efficiently, and then you don't have to spend so much time farming so that you can send your kid to school. No, thank you. So like that kind of infrastructure that would be like setting up first world banking level institutions that are actually stable, that people can actually trust, or like being able to loan in a sustainable way, I think financial skills is a really important part of that, and like, a lot of that relies on infrastructure within the government. But also I'm just going to move on and talk about how some of the negating team's supposed benefits actually like have inherent contradictions and don't follow through. So that they've characterized governments as being like really corrupt, but then they also want like the money to be paid in like regional currency. So we think that that's not going to be very effective, because like you can't rely on a corrupt government to to control the money supply and have like good controls on inflation and especially in like nations where like resources are scarce. So like if a developed country has like a shortage of food, but everybody is getting like a certain amount of money every week. No, thank you. A certain amount of money every week. Everyone might be able to get like the 100 pesos or whatever, but the cost of the food is just going to rise to meet that. And like if it's not backed by an actually good currency that has got sustainability outside of itself. So a lot of these regional currencies can't control like for the potential effects of inflation that like everybody getting this money is going to have on like goods and services. Then about like more engagement with democracy, like we basically think that the reason that people aren't engaging with democracy isn't because they don't have enough money, but it's because the governments actually suck. So we just accept their characterization that like the governments are corrupt, but we don't think that they get their benefits of like if people are going to have more money, they're going to be more engaged with democracy. We think they're just going to be richer and equally disillusioned with how terrible their government is, because it is, and they're not going to engage in it. So they're not going to get benefits of people engaging in democracy because they mischaracterize why people are disengaged with democracy. In terms of benefits for women, okay, so women might be able to circumnavigate like patriarchal institutions by having their own money, but they also would be able to circumnavigate those if there was like Western and non-discriminatory infrastructure that they could interact with. So like we also get those benefits outside of the house. Like they can also like use the roads. They can also like use the school, They can also use the schools, and they can also get the malaria shots from the Bill Gates Foundation. And this is not like something that is like mutually exclusive from the development aid in the form of infrastructure. And that's why we're here today.
Thanks, speaker for speech. Welcome forward, third Ashworth.
Today's debate isn't about what developmental aid could have been, but it's about how developmental aid actually is. Today we've shown you so many reasons as to why the developmental aid that we currently have doesn't go towards the most impoverished people in the country, and instead are often just benefiting the people who are already the most privileged in the country. Because those who we actually want to help are those who are literally living in poverty and can't support their families, we win today's debate. Two main questions. Firstly, does developmental aid in its current form actually work? And secondly, how do these impoverished families actually use this money, and how does this directly improve their lives? So on the first point of clash, Does developmental aid in the current form actually work? What have we told you? Firstly, we told you that corruption is a really big issue in what we actually see, right? Because of the fact that we're giving developmental aid to the countries that are the most poor, these most poor countries often are the ones who have the least structured governments as well, and they're often the ones who are the most corrupt. What we told you is that these often get given to these corrupt officials, and then they're often used for things that aren't actually developmental, and instead they're often used for military purposes or other just ways to fund the lavish lifestyles of these individuals. What did we actually hear from the negating team? They just told us basically that we just won't give developmental aid to these corrupt countries, right? But the thing is often when we give developmental aid to these countries, we don't actually realise that they're going to use it in these areas, and we actually have the benefit of the doubt for them, and we often just give it to them because we expect these governments to use it in the right ways. We think it's still going to happen no matter what. Secondly, what did we tell you? We told you that even if it was true that these governments weren't super corrupt, and even if it was true that these governments were building this infrastructure, often it also just still doesn't help these individuals that they wanted to be talking about. Because why did we tell you this? Firstly, because of the fact that the government just needs to cater to those that they know has more political power, right? So they're going to cater to those who live in the capital. They're going to cater to those who are richer because they know these people are going to be the ones who are literally propping up the government and the ones voting in them in. What this means is that even if there are lots of highways being built and lots of jobs being generated to these rich areas, the most impoverished people who are living in the rural areas aren't actually going to even be able to benefit from these highways that are being built anyways because they live so far away, and they're also just not going to be the ones who are getting getting employed to build these highways anyways. Secondly, what we're going to tell you is that even if it was true that we were getting the infrastructures that we need in the most impoverished areas, let's say building schools, often the bureaucrats that are choosing what type of infrastructure to build, they're just so far removed from the realities of what poverty actually looks like in their country that they don't actually understand what these individuals actually need either. So we see this, for example, where obviously we all agree that education is something really important, and so government officials often choose to build schools in these areas. But often the realities of these areas are just that they're so poor and they lack so much food that even when there are schools, they just really can't afford to send their children to schools anyways because they need their children to stay home and earn a living for the families. So even when we do get this good quality infrastructure that they're talking about on their side of the house, sometimes these communities are just so poor and need so much more that they can't even use this infrastructure that they actually wanted to talk about. Last response that we had from them, they told us that they were fine with going around the government if it meant that they were really corrupt, and that they were fine with things such as China's developmental aid being in the form of China building highways in Africa. What we're going to tell you is that's even worse, right? Because the Chinese government doesn't care about impoverished people, and they don't give developmental aid when they build highways in order to help these impoverished people, and instead they do that for their own benefit, right? China builds bridges in Africa because they want the economic gains from building these bridges in Africa, which means they build it in the richest areas and they get all the profits when they build these bridges. They're not helping the poor families at all. Second point of clash, how do we actually help these impoverished families when we give them these money? How do they use it? What did we hear from the affirming team? Negating team. What we heard from them is basically that people who live in poverty just don't know how to save money, right? Because apparently they just have no concept of money, and they'll just get it one day because they don't have a till. They're just gonna put it in their pocket and not use this properly. What we're going to tell you is that this just isn't true. Firstly, it really benefits them because they are just able to meet the basic needs of their family, even if it means that they're not saving this money. If it means that they're able to put food on the table, that's still something that we stand for. But secondly, what we're also going to tell you is that we just think that people do actually have a concept of saving. Even if it may be true that you weren't able to go to school, you still know that buying maybe a better farm equipment is something that's going to be really good for your family, and so it's going to be something that you want to save up for. You don't actually need to have a till in order to recognize the fact that saving a bit of money each week will be really good for your family. And so we see this, for example, with examples in Bangladesh when the Goodman Bank gave microloans to women, right? These women were able to recognize the fact that they needed to use this money in order to start businesses for their families, which means that we were able to lift all of these women out of poverty, which we think is a really good thing. The third need to know as well is that like communities are often the ones who know what they actually need, right? So if you were a community that needed a school, we think it's perfectly viable for you guys to like pool the money together that you got from these type of from this like direct investment from these countries in order to like build the schools you need, right? Or if you needed a well, you don't need to know how to build a well and you don't need like a huge engineering degree to do so, but instead you can just pool your money together to buy a well for your community if that's what you actually need, yes.
So you do need an engineering degree to build an electricity grid.
No, you don't need to build an electricity grid, and instead you just literally need to like buy this for your community, right? We're not saying that you need to be like an electrician who needs to like build everything for yourself, and instead there's this thing called buying, okay? We think that's perfectly viable. Last thing that we're going to tell you is that we think the long-term changes that we're talking about is actually extremely important in today's debate. Because often when we give developmental aid to countries, it's often done in order to like increase the amount of democracy in these countries as well, and we think we're only able to get this on our side of the house. Why is this the case? Because firstly, we just think that like when you actually have your basic needs met, that's when you can actually even go to things such as like just like going to the polls, or that's when you can actually band together with your community and talk about what you actually need. You can't do this unless your basic needs aren't met. What did we hear from the other side? What they told us is that no, that's not going to happen. People will just be rich and disenfranchised anyways. But we don't think this is the case, because when you actually get this type of money from like other countries, that's when you actually start to realise what your life could have actually been like. That's when you actually start to realise what you've been missing out on all your other years, when your government's been like siphoning off the money elsewhere, and that's when you actually feel angry about the situation that you've been in, and that's when you feel really politically motivated. We think this is a really good thing, because that's when the impoverished families that we're actually talking about can actually start lobbying for the infrastructure changes that they wanted to talk about. That's when they can actually start lobbying for the infrastructure changes that won't just help people in the capital like what we get in the current form, but instead that's when they can start lobbying for the infrastructure changes that they actually need, that they know will actually help themselves. Not only are their basic needs met, but due to the fact that we politically motivate them in the long term, that means that infrastructural changes, that what they wanted to talk about, will actually happen on either side, and instead will actually happen at a more effective and a more efficient rate on our side of the house. We are proud to affirm.
Thanks, Speaker, for speech. Welcome forward, third next.
Ladies and gentlemen, in this debate, a proposition have come out and told us that they'd just happily throw money at a problem, provide band-aids, and that's all they're going to do. To fix these problems, miraculously they will disappear. We're realists on our side of the house, and we just understand that implicitly that's not going to happen under their side of the house. So we had an onus in this debate to prove to you that we could provide better, independent and sustainable economic growth, and that inherently that would benefit people under our side of the house. We've done that, but more than that, we can prove to you that they just implicitly failed to do so under their side of the house. So to address the three areas of contention in this debate, first of all, I will discuss the two competing narratives that our teams have provided in terms of how each of our mechanisms are going to work and why theirs falls down and why ours is valid. Secondly, I'll discuss the question as to whether poor people can effectively use this money if it's just thrown at them. And thirdly, the question of whether infrastructural investment actually works. So on to these two competing narratives. Now, the affirming side of the house painted a world in which if we build schools, no one can attend them because everyone's too busy and they're at work, right? Or they're too poor to have cars to use highways that we'd supposedly be building under our side of the house. But they said, but if we give these individuals money, they can actually work together and it'll all be amazing. Now, on our side of the house, we provided you actually tangible mechanisms which don't fall victim to tragedy of the commons, right? Which is the idea that they do fall victim to, because ultimately no one's going to band together when you have to address your immediate needs in the short term and therefore they're not achieving tangible societal change and economic growth under their side of the house, because these individuals have no immediate incentive to work together and build wells when they could just be buying themselves money. So, no thank you. So under our side of the house, we said, you know what, if we give diverse kinds of aid, then we can build these roads, we can build these schools, and now they exist, which is better than they've got under their side of the house. But because we're providing a diverse range of aid, we can actually provide food to these individuals through this aid system that we already have that's existing, and they can therefore have greater opportunity to go to school because they're not so implicitly poor, because the international community's invested in their futures, right? And so because we are not just throwing money at the problem, because we're invested, we can actually help them out and get them out of this poverty so that they can be developing a much more sustainable economy. We think that that's much more effective because then you have tangible systems and well-functioning people who are able to build that economy. So we felt that our narrative was superior to theirs under our side of the house. Now, secondly, this question as to whether poor people can effectively use the money if it's given to them. So they told us basically if you give people these resources, they'll do amazing things with it and pull themselves out of poverty. Now we told you again and again down the line that there are several reasons why this doesn't work. First of all, people don't have the financial training to use money effectively. Now, we said that when you're hungry, you're going to spend all that money on your immediate needs, right? Because you're hungry now, under their characterisation, rather than invest that in long-term investment. I'll take you in a moment. So, for example, you're just going to go out and buy food rather than go and get crops. Yes?
Don't you think, though, that people can rationalise their realities, know that if they just save up, just for 1 month or two, that they can buy that piece of farming equipment that improves their life, whereas on your side of the house,
Okay,
they might
cool.
have access to that, they can never actually afford to buy it?
Okay, cool, thank you. So I think that the reason that that doesn't happen under your side of the house is basically that if you just throw money at a problem, you have to go and you have no other way to get any food because you've cut off all other forms of financial aid. You're worried about how you're going to get your next meal, not how you're going to get your meal 6 months down the line, because you have no mechanisms to even know if you're going to be here 6 months down the line, because they do not provide any tangible mechanisms as to how they will be, because they can't support them in the long term and are just throwing money at the problem. No, thank you. So the affirming side of the house came back and they challenged our characterisation. They said that people are running these businesses already. They're already financially capable. We said that there's a reason why that's not sustainable in the long term. We told you that that was ultimately at an ad hoc level, that it's sort of done as is convenient, and that's not the way to build an economy. We told you that these people aren't keeping books, they're just chucking their money in their pockets, and they don't have actual financial skills because they haven't been educated. So we said that also, not everyone actually has these skills in the first place because not everyone is an owner of a business and therefore doesn't fall under their characterisation. Secondly, we said that their side of the house's model falls down because if everyone gets money and resources are still scarce because they've cut off every other form of aid that there is, ultimately that's just going to raise the cost of those resources, right? So that means that they're just contributing to inflation in their societies, and ultimately that is harmful. So on to this third point of clash about whether infrastructural investment actually works. So they said that the government, no thank you, they said that the government is ultimately no good in implementing these forms of aid. They told us that bureaucrats, first of all, don't know what they're doing, and second of all, they're corrupt. So we challenge that characterisation on several levels. First of all, we think that bureaucrats are ultimately the best educated, and that's how they've managed to get into those positions in the first place, right? So you don't have a Minister of Finance who doesn't know anything about finances. We think inherently you're better equipped to deal with the economy than just a farmer who has had no education. So we think that implicitly they do know what they're doing in that respect. Secondly, we think that under their side of the house, they're not implicitly mitigating corruption as they would have you believe, given that they've claimed that it does exist under their side of the house. We think that if everyone has more money and you have a corrupt government, you're just going to raise taxes, right? So that you can just ensure your hegemony, which exists as they claim. But actually, we challenge that characterisation of these politicians as inherently corrupt and unable to implement any of this development. We'll take them in a second. We think that there are several mechanisms as to why they have very little incentive to be corrupt. We think that you are more likely to be overthrown if you neglect your people. We think that if the economy benefits because they're looking after the economy and the people in the economy, so do they, because everyone's standards of living are raised, right? And we think thirdly that when you're actually engaging in broad developmental aid, you're accountable to the international community, and therefore there's a mechanism for that. I'll take you
Even
on
if
that.
people don't know how to save, and it's just true that we give them money and they spend it to put food on the table for their families, why is that such a bad thing?
We're not saying that is a bad thing, but we're saying that we're giving people food on their tables under our side of the house because we're giving them broad forms of developmental aid, right? So we're getting that benefit and we're building up the economy. It's pretty simple when you look at it. All they're doing is throwing money at the problem. So at the end of this debate, it's pretty clear that they were prepared to just broadly assert that they were achieving all these wonderful things when actually they're causing harm. On the brief point of benefits to women, they told us that women would do well if they could apply for funding. But we told you as a counter to that if you raise education levels because you're broadening infrastructure, you're inherently breaking down patriarchy anyway, right? So that's beneficial to women also under our side of the house. At the end of this debate, we provided tangible mechanisms which is benefiting all of society, and therefore we are proud to oppose. Thank you.
Next speaker to speak, welcome Board Leader of Opposition.
The debate today, as we've seen it from the affirming side, has been mischaracterizations and harms that they cannot prove and benefits that are reaching. In terms of the mischaracterization, the affirming side has come at all of the benefits we've been able to prove through structural change by simply stating that we are throwing money at the government, which, as we have explained multiple times, is not our goal, which makes most of the rebuttal against our status quo irrelevant that have been brought up by the affirming team. Overall, we need to be looking at which of our sides makes a more effective and sustainably economic world for the third world. We have proven the benefits that come from structure, and the only benefits that the affirming team has actually been able to prove that aren't just reaching have been also ones that come under the status quo and our proposed system. However, our one also includes this structural change that will then improve the economy, building up over years to come, as we've stated. They have made ridiculous assertions on the affirming side and failed to address some of the main criticisms we have about money being thrown blindly at people. Resource scarcity was one of our big legitimate points that was barely touched by the affirming, saying, oh, these people, they'll just pull their money and build a well, which, as we've said on the negating team, is a ridiculous assertion. These people are not going to be doing so. If they're in such dire straits as the affirming team says, surely the only consideration is going to be where the next meal comes from. I will briefly now just discuss some of the points brought up by the affirming team that we have either shut down or just said that are virtually irrelevant and reaching. The fact that $20 extra in a woman's pocket is going to destroy the patriarchy is a reaching, very weak point. They made another point that was unsubstantiated about people having an extra $20 in their pocket, and that makes them more politically engaged. We on the negating team have shut these points down and said that there is no real linkage, and any linkage that there is already happens with the structural change we're making. So on the point of which is more effective, it is very clearly structural change, and on the point of whether it's more sustainable, it is clearly structural change. In the affirming team's world, there is still no reliable electricity, and that is a problem. The affirming team simply states, oh, people have more money, they'll buy a tractor. From where? As we've said on the gating team, with structural change, there will be tractors to buy, there will be roads to drive on, there will be the skills in that area so that these things can and will happen. They have refused to address our point of inflation and how in resource-scarce countries this money is simply just going to become devalued and mean less than it was originally. And they are making Again, reaching unsubstantiated claims that simply giving them money will change the culture in these countries that stops them from succeeding. And we say on the negating team, that is a ridiculous point, and the only way to change structure and culture is through this infrastructural change, which is why we believe that the status quo must stand. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for speech. Now to close the debate, we invite up the leader of the proposition.
Gating wanted to try and claim every single benefit in the world in their case. They wanted to give people aid, and they wanted to give people food, and they wanted to give people money, while simultaneously building up the infrastructure, building up everything that would allow them to access the types of opportunities that they've been shut out from. Not only did that actually mischaracterize what the present problem is with developmental aid, but it also put the cart before the horse, in that at the point where they focused solely on having infrastructural investment, they belied the fact that the types of people who had access to that weren't the types of people who were actually the people who were trying to help in this debate. We tell you that we were the side of the house that actually benefited those most in need in the most direct and tangible way. With that in mind, there are 3 points of clash. Firstly, what are the current problems of developmental aid and how do we circumnavigate that? Secondly, how do we uplift these people economically? And finally, how do we bring about social and political change? Okay, firstly then, we got up and told you clearly at first that there is clear problems with corruption and political incentives that play on these governments to mean that they don't invest in the rural areas. At the point where they realised at first they had literally no response to that, they then shifted their response to say, oh well, we don't really want that. What we support is like NGOs and like foreign direct investment. So even if they want to live in that fantasy, we'll tell you we can still beat them on those grounds. We told you that there was a problem and that often that wasn't able to be targeted towards rural communities. That often that actually came with these like foreign countries like putting in stipulations that they had to open up their markets to foreign investment that took control of the resources and shut out these poor people from ever gaining the economic benefits in the future. Finally, we told you, and crucially, it was only the people who already had existing capital that were able to benefit from that infrastructure, right? It was the person who already owned a business with a number of trucks who could use the new highway to get his goods to the ports. The clear fundamental problem with their case was that people who already were working like all day and didn't have any money to spare couldn't buy that tractor that they so desperately wanted them to do, couldn't go to the school, couldn't use the highways. We told you that you needed to have that like first solution before you can start getting anything on top of that. Okay, so how do we benefit these people in the immediate term economically? We told you that we can meet these people's basic needs. They never responded to that other than to say that like people didn't know how to save. We told you that even if that was true, we win this point because we are able to uplift these people who are in the worst situations. We can lift them out of poverty, we can actually put food on the table of these families. But secondly, we tell you these are the people who are best able to rationalise their realities, that they actually have had enough experience in their own lives to know that that piece of farming equipment would make it much more efficient for them, could uplift themselves and their families. And even like failing that, they can quite clearly learn over time to do that. Secondly and crucially, we told you that these people could upskill themselves when they had the money to do so. That is the point at which they could take advantage of the infrastructural investment. That is the point where they could move to a place with better job opportunities. Simply like putting in overarching infrastructure without helping those who actually needed it most never was going to solve the problem. So why was it then that we were actually the side of the house that got social political change and got infrastructure in the long term? We told you that these people would be politically enfranchised, that they'd be able to go to the polls, and once you meet your basic hierarchy of needs, that is when you go up and try and pursue these more social freedoms. And crucially, that they were now able to engage in a comparative world where they saw what the government was doing beforehand, and they saw what they themselves could do, and were better able to hold the government to account in that sense. Finally, on my point about women,
All they really said was that these people can circumnavigate these structures at third, but like the clear point is that they didn't allow these like women to overcome the familial things and the familial ties and like the community that held them back. We actually allowed these women to be financially independent. At the end of today's debate, we actually uplifted those who needed it most. We provided a real solution who won today's debate.